Amigos, muchas gracias a todos los que llegaron puntual a la presentación. La ciudad es un caos, estamos esperando a una de las presentadoras y al público que confirmó. En cuanto lleguen, que esperemos que no sean más de 15 minutos, comenzaremos con la presentación. Una disculpa, es un imprevisto que no pudimos prever, pero empezamos en máximo 15 minutos. Muchas gracias. Listo. Buenos días a todos. Gracias por estar aquí en este día que la ciudad es un caos y que no lo previmos. Seguramente muchos de nuestros invitados están atorados en la ciudad por el desfile del 20 de noviembre, pero bueno, vamos a disfrutar esta presentación que seguro va a estar increíble y voy a leer unas pequeñas notas sobre cada uno de los participantes. Booklaunch Filipinx, that's the way you pronounce it, Filipinx. Es uno de los eventos de clausura de Siembra que ha tenido múltiples proyectos desde que comenzó en febrero de 2020 en Curimansuto. Durante estos 20 meses se hicieron presentes cuestiones como qué lugar en el mundo ocupa la galería de arte en el país y en la comunidad a la que pertenece, qué permea a su alrededor y qué forja su futuro, y estuvo abierta a distintas disciplinas y respuestas que pudieran surgir. A manera de una de las cosechas de este periodo de siembra, invitamos a participar a la artista multidisciplinaria y nominada para el premio James Beard, chef radicada en Nueva York, Dimayuga, al lanzamiento de su nuevo libro, Filipnx, Heritage Recipes from the Diaspora en México. Dimayuga radica en Nueva York, es artista multidisciplinaria y coautora de este libro. Descendiente de padres inmigrantes filipinos y criada en la Bahía de San Francisco. Suele trabajar con lo efímero e impermanente, a menudo produciendo experiencias con otros artistas científicos, diseñadores y agricultores. Con licenciatura en Humanidades, es una chef autodidacta que ha capacitado y dirigido reconocidos restaurantes como chef ejecutiva de la Mishan Chinese Food de Nueva York y con un puesto generado solo para ella como directora creativa de comida y cultura en las cadenas de hoteles de Standard International. Ha colaborado como escritora para el New York Times Cooking and Food, es anfitriona de un programa de cocina experimental para NTS Radio, artista asociada en el Performance Space New York y consejera culinaria para el Lower East Side Girls Club. Muchas gracias, Ángela. Nikki Nakazawa, amiga nuestra, nacida en Estados Unidos y radicada en Oaxaca, es socia de Agave y Mezcales Neta. Desde que decidió hacer de México su hogar en 2007, se ha desenvuelto en diferentes disciplinas artísticas como productora de música, artes plásticas, cine, comida y bebida. En 2012 cofundó el restaurante pop-up y servicio de catering llamado Pichón, al que adoramos, y ahondando en su conocimiento sobre platillos indígenas y mestizos, prácticas regionales e historia culinaria. Es anfitriona de Nectar Corridor, un podcast de Western Radio Collective que comparte historias de productores de mezcal, promotores, agricultores en México. Elena Arraigadas, cocinera y madre y amiga, es una de las figuras más importantes de la escena gastronómica en México, chef copropietaria de Rosetta, posicionada actualmente en el número 9 de la lista Best Latin American. También es dueña de un popular grupo de restaurantes y panaderías, Rosetta, Lardo, Pizzería Lardo y Café Nin. En 2019 se publicó su primer libro, Rosetta, publicado por la editorial Sexto Piso. Qué gusto tenerte aquí, it's a pleasure. Es curador, asistente en el Museo Guggenheim de Nueva York. Recientemente le comisionaron al artista Woods el film Anthem, que para quienes lo hayan visto y lo puedan ver, es un proyecto fantástico. Es un proyecto de gran escala diseñado especialmente para la rotonda central del museo. Se unió al equipo curatorial del Guggenheim para la investigación de la exposición Art and China After 1989, Theater of the World, y coordinó su itinerancia por el SF MoMA y el Museo Guggenheim de Bilbao. Es de los curadores que fundó el Asian Art Circle en 2019 para el museo, un grupo de adquisición dedicado a facilitar los esfuerzos continuos del museo para diversificar su colección y programación a través de el enfoque en las contribuciones de artistas establecidos en Asia y diásporas de este continente. Los dejo con nuestras presentadoras y muchas gracias otra vez por su presencia.
Muchas gracias. Okay, that's all the Spanish that I have, so I'm sorry. We have to switch to English. Thank you, Raul, for the beautiful introduction, which I think I understood half of it. But yeah, I'm very excited to be here. Unfortunately, we're running into this revolutionary day, which I find is kind of interesting, you know, during this event, which I find is quite revolutionary in the terms of we're sitting here, but we're also running into some military parade, stopping our friends coming into the vicinity of this conversation. But I think since we are being broadcasted into a larger channel, so I think we can carry the conversation, and hopefully the more of our friends will arrive despite the disruption of the military parade. So I want to start by maybe want to ask Angela, you, since you're the kind of the center or the kind of the reason why we're gathering here today to celebrate this book in Mexico, and I want to ask you to tell us a bit more about the inspiration of the book, which I know was such has such a beautiful story too, in terms of how you envisioned the book and how the book came out. Maybe you want to just give everyone a little bit background story before we launch into the conversation about migration histories and material histories, etc.
Is this on? Yeah. Oh, I don't even know if I need it. I need it. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Really excited to share my book here in Mexico City because it's actually my second book stop, which is kind of unusual. I think when anyone releases anything wherever they're from, they do say they're from New York like me, they might do a US tour and go all over the US and then end up somewhere else internationally. But I was really excited to do it here in Mexico City next. I did 3 events in New York and then was really happy to be invited here by Cory Manzuto, so thank you for having me, and having X here and have these wonderful people that we're going to learn a lot about in this conversation. But really a lot of that inspiration came from thinking about different timelines in which the relationship to the Philippines and Mexico paralleled and overlapped both personally and historically. But the inspiration, so we're going to dive into that at some point, but then the inspiration behind making this book was really thinking about my diasporic experience being Filipino, and I think, again, that makes sense to really talk about that here in Mexico City. But I grew up in San Jose in California. I've been to the Philippines once, but I grew up in a household where Filipino food was the center of our social activities. That's how we related to each other. That's how I made myself feel useful in a big family, you know, getting kind of lost. Like, I have 5 siblings, and so when you are in a big family, you want to show that you have something to offer or sort of like not get in trouble. But the way that I participated in my family was to help with my babysitter cooking. My mom and my grandmother's a really amazing Filipino cook from Pampanga, and so most of the food in the book comes from that region, which has this really interesting connection to Mexico as well, which I think Nikki is going to help talk about. But yeah, so this is a book about Filipino American recipes, my memories of that. There's also recipes that literally come from my dreams, so that there's no real origin of that except for me sort of receiving that in my mind and me producing it, so it is Filipino and it makes sense with the rest of the recipes. But it's memory based. I talk a lot about ancestral, my experience understanding my cuisine through celebrating my ancestry. So it's kind of everything, and I squeezed it all in here next to 100 recipes.
But I love this book because it's very much centered on your own personal journey and kind of where you grew up, and really kind of grounded in the narratives that you built around your childhood, and also kind of, you know, when you first open the book, you see pictures of family pictures, and kind of really kind of centers around what the food culture is really about, is a human relations. And I really feel like when I arrived in Mexico City, I feel like this is a city of food culture. Every day I smell food, I listening to food being chopped, you know, like the sound, the sensorium kind of imagination of food, which is so interesting. But maybe I will bring Elena into the conversation because I thought an interview of yours, which I really enjoyed, you talk about your food being not necessarily, your food as being Mexican food, but not necessarily in a way that people traditionally understand what Mexican food really is. I really like the idea that I've really complicated a kind of a hegemonic understanding of a particular category of a cuisine, because for me, I realized all the Mexican food I have been eating in New York has nothing to do with the food here. Like literally, I don't even know what to order because names are completely different, and there's a certain kind of projection and certain kinds of certain kinds of projection and simplification happens when the food travel outside of a region to other places. And I wonder if you want to comment on that a little bit before we go to Nikki talking about all of this.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Angela, for letting me cook your food, which of course was a lot of learning and a lot of opening my mind, and I think that what food is, and that's what I enjoy most about food and ingredients. And as you said, X, I really enjoy and I like to always open my mind, and it's true that Mexican food has a very established pattern of what it is, and it's really like a canon that was established in the 20th century, and it was in a very strategic way of the government to really nationalize and to bring a whole things of images and symbols to make Mexico a very clear nation. So in that sense, Mexican food was shortened, like made it much more simplified than what it actually is. Mexico, as you all know, it's one of the most biodiverse countries on earth, and we have much more than what you can see and what I can see and what I know. We have so many herbs, spices, vegetables. It's like really, really astonishing as a cook to have all those ingredients. So for me, I really respect traditional Mexican food, and there are many, 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 many amazing cooks all over Mexico, but I always try to do and to give Mexican food another face, in a sense, like much more than what it's seen and what we all think about. And some people feel my food is not necessarily Mexican because I always try to move outside of this. And what I found much more interesting, it's all the ingredients that I feel now are part of Mexico. Maybe they are not all of them pre-Hispanic, but for what now Mexico is, I feel they are Mexican. Because I think food is that, it's just something that keeps adding and changing and adding and adding and adding. So that's what makes me happy about it.
That's beautiful. Actually, I love that you bring image into the conversation where we're situated in a kind of visual, cultural, institution or gallery setting, and kind of thinking about what you're talking about almost remind me of some conversation I have in the art world about cultural essentialism, essentially kind of thinking about what really is the identity of a particular kind of food that is outside of a nationalistic kind of project, right? So I really love to understand that history a bit better. Maybe Nikki, our historian here, can help us expand upon a little bit more, because we were talking about revolution earlier, and you talk about how erase the traces of Asian immigrants here also kind of starts with revolution. Do you want to expand that a little bit and to really kind of setting the polemics of this conversation?
Sure. So today is the day of the Mexican Revolution. This is an important event, 1910, when we had the overthrow of Porfirio Diaz, who was the president for over 30 years of Oaxacan origins. This is a revolution that doesn't take place from one day to the next, but is a series of agrarian uprisings across Mexico. and this begins a period of tremendous, or is, a period of tremendous transformation of rural Mexico, and also the consolidation of the project of Mexican identity. So what does it mean? This idea of Mexicanness begins to emerge, right? And so one of the things that I'm really excited to talk to you guys about this, because Angela and I have been friends for some time, and something that comes up a lot in our conversations has to do with the connection between Mexico and the Philippines. And this connection begins in 1565 with the Manila Galleon. And so these are trade ships that would travel in groups of 4 with up to 500 passengers on each ship. And this trade route lasted 250 years, which is a long time, And so this is up until 1815, I think. And so it's right before Mexican independence. And we have, during this period of 250 years, up to 60,000 Asian immigrants coming through. So what's fascinating is that Mexico and the Philippines are established in this relationship. And then it's not that, I don't know whether, it's that we've forgotten this, but it was so hegemonic, it was so complete, these spaces of transculturation or acculturation that we don't really have today necessarily language for speaking of it. So I think what's really special about today and about the emotional response that I had and I have had with Angela being in Mexico and also reading the book, like really getting teary-eyed, because you just see like all these foods like chocolate, empanadas, bizcochos. There's so many different recipes and ingredients that come from this period, and that now we have the opportunity to kind of recognize today as a part of a deep relationship. This is not, this is also part of your experience growing up in a Mexican mixed brown environment in California, but this is also something that reaches back hundreds of years.
Thank you. Wow. I learned so much. I'm not qualified to moderate this conversation because, first of all, I'm not a historian of Mexican history. I'm also not a historian of food. But I'm just excited because I think a lot of this conversation is related to identity and kind of a diasporic identity, which I am sort of an expert of. So I'm a quarter qualified. I want to go back to what, Angela, you were talking about, the food related to a hometown of yours. Remind me the name of it. No, the Pampanga. Tell us more about Pampanga, and there is a kind of a relationship with Mexico too,
yeah,
no?
I think Nikki and I can tag team this weirdly, but my mom is from a town called Pampanga in the Philippines, and being raised in California and not really having access to the Philippines and being interested in being a professional cook later in life. I wanted to be a chef ever since I was a child. And then when I started professionally cooking and was around delicious Pampangan Filipino food, did I only realize in my early 20s, being a young line cook, that Pampanga was even special, because I saw an American food magazine, commercial food magazine, that Pampanga was special. I saw a 10-page article about the cuisine, and I was like, wait, I'm from there. And the food is good. And then so I asked my mom about it, and they're like, yeah, well, Pampanga is known to be a place with amongst Filipinos in the Philippines, they view Pampangans as having a distinguished palate, and I felt really lucky, and I didn't know anything really outside of that, and then most of these recipes are Pampangan, so that's the flavors that I know. And for example, when I asked my mom about where she's from in Pampanga, because it's a big place, and the town she's from is actually called Mexico, Pampanga. And Nikki I learned something from Nikki today about Pampanga in Mexico, but I also simultaneously then growing up in the 90s in San Jose in California, San Jose is 30% Asian and 30% Mexican. Of those 30% of Asians, it's primarily Filipinos. So for me, looking at like pop culture or music that I like, there was such a binary of what I saw with people that I liked or like musicians that I like. It was white or black, and I was kind of like into, I was like kind of this like Filipino alt girl, and in my like Catholic school, which is also very Mexican and Filipino, and I grew up going to Catholic school from kindergarten through 12th grade, and so we have a lot of similarities there about like how we're raised or like how we're guilt tripped, etc. And so yeah, I felt comfortable being merged with being like a brown Asian is how I identify. With the Mexicans that I grew up with, and we all kind of blended styles and blended music, and so that's sort of the environment that I grew up around, like then eating Filipino food and then understanding what I am as an American. And then Nikki found this amazing article. Did you find it today?
Yes.
Nikki's an amazing researcher, and I don't know if anyone knows, I don't know if everyone in the audience knows, but Nikki does mezcal, right? I mean, Nikki has a spirits label called Neta, but also is extremely intelligent and is teaching us a lot.
But as you were speaking, I was just thinking about your experience growing up in this community of Mexicans, of Filipinos, of other Asians, and all these different cultures coming together, and thinking if we could, imagine that in 1570, or like 1600s as the scene, because what I was reading today was essentially it was a mule driver. So all of the goods that came through the Manila galleon from Manila to Acapulco then had to be brought by mule to Veracruz to go to Europe. So all of the people who were most of the people who were bringing all the goods on their mules were Filipino. And so I read it was a Filipino arriero from Pampanga. And the reason why we know about him was that there was this court case regarding his assets when he died. And so it was talking about all his like silk stockings and other things. But, he was a part of this, like, they called it like the Chino network. And I thought that would be, maybe hashtag
Our
Chino network.
Here.
But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there were Japanese people, Indians, Filipinos, folks coming from all over Asia on these boats, and then marrying indigenous women if they were enslaved on the boats, because marrying someone indigenous in Mexico meant that you could become a free man. And so this whole environment, which kind of sounds like how you grew up, like everybody's sharing their recipes, sharing their knowledges. And one of the things that came out of that cultural exchange was distillation, which is why I have come to know a little bit about the Philippines and the connection with Mexico because of the distillation of tuba. So the fermented sap from the coconut palm, and coconuts were also brought through the Manila galleon. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about alt girl in the 17th century.
Well, I mean, also one of the reasons why I was excited to do our event here in Mexico City with all of these people on stage is the impetus. I mean, the impetus for that was I was in I was in Oaxaca last October. I stayed in an artist residency there to finish my book, and that's when Nikki taught me about the coconut palm trees being delivered here by Filipinos, and then skill sharing happened where this coconut sap was then fermented, turned into a high-proof alcohol, and then distilled a way that then was taught to their Mexican brethren, and that's the precursor to tequila production and mezcal production. And the fact that I I don't know that, but began to know that, means that this for me is such a long journey into figuring out, how those multiple generations of that connection, our ancestry in the early 1500s, or then me being this like teenager brown alt girl going to shows with like Filipinos and all kinds of Asians and Mexicans and like moshing, like what type of moshing happened, and I want to know about it. So so there's just so much to learn about, and why I feel really connected to this country, and when I like eat somewhere like Rosetta or go to the market, get really emotional. My primary function, often if something's really deep, or if I'm touched, or if I like something, is usually I get emotional. And I always feel really emotional when I have a connection to, or when I try something new, or try these local ingredients that just feels like it's reverberating in my like sort of like ancestral experience. And so this is just really liberating to get to be here and talk about this, and by way of food, which I think for me, most things that I appreciate, whether that's food or music or film, when I have that emotional connection, there's a reason why, and a curiosity of like trying to dig out why. So thanks for moderating this, X, and helping me get emotional about it all with these people.
My favorite kind of moderation is the panelists just continue to talk and I disappear, which is perfect. But I want to bring Elena into the conversation a bit too, because I was inspired when you were talking about Skillshare. I want, because Elena, you're kind of trained also outside of Mexico as well, no? And I'm interested in kind of thinking about what kind of training, and like some are ancestral training and maybe some are more modern kind of chef training. I don't really know the language of that, so I apologize to getting it all wrong. But I'm curious to understand, different kind of processes, and is there a way that kind of can connect ancestral with modern technique, and is there other kinds of way of thinking about, like even I'm just more kind of thinking about artists' practice nowadays, kind of thinking about what are the ways to bring technology into something that is also historical. Like, is there that kind of mashing in your own practice and your own way of working? And same question to you too as well, Nikki and Angela, thinking about the old and new, the future and past.
Well, of course, old and new, I think it's the best. I am more into old than into new, but of course technology, it's amazing in terms of machinery and in terms of taking less time to do many things in cooking. However, when you go too much into that side, it's not something I feel very happy about. And like yesterday, for example, making the lumpia, for me that's the best when I do cooking, and that's the best of cooking, when you really feel and use your hands and touch, and never like letting that disappear, because I think cooking is about that. It's really connecting with your senses. However, of course, there are many other ways of technologies that make it easier. But in my case, we always go to traditional methods, and we always try never to change that. And for example, in terms of mezcal, it's something that I also enjoy very much. Like when mezcal, it's like the most ancient way of making it, when it's even, making the distillation in clay. And I think the most ancient methods are the ones that connect much more to the earth and to the ground. And many times tradition, but I think it's much more than tradition. It's just more related to where the food and the ingredients come from.
That's nice. I love that. I think it's true, but I also want to ask a bit more about that dish, and what is that dish and what's the method, so that everyone, when you taste it, you know exactly how it's made. Do you want to talk about it?
Dish?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was really fun working with Elena's team and Elena, because that you always have to have an entry point. So first, of course, we talked about what the menu is, and then I got to work with her staff, and there was one staff member that kind of ended up leading, I think, the prep, because did you say that they're Chinese, or they're like grew up around Filipinos? I couldn't remember that.
We had a lot of luck in the kitchen, because we were all a bit lost when Angela sent us her recipes. Because although there were many ingredients that we were related to, there were a few that not at all, like the shrimp paste that it's fermented and it has a very pungent smell and flavor. So fortunately, we had a girl that just started to work with us, and her parents are Chinese. Mm-hmm. So she was completely familiarized with Angela's recipes. So that made us a bit easier to understand.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So she's Chinese, but she was raised in San Diego, which she had lots of Filipino friends. And then, so the dish in particular that Elena was talking about is called lumpia, which is similar to an egg roll, but it's like long and skinny. It's like equal parts meat and a bunch of vegetables, but the joy of eating that dish is just like crunching on this. It's kind of like, it's like an egg roll, but thin and crispy. And it was just really sweet, because then obviously the connection to Filipinos making this dish is our relationship to China. And so there's a lot of Filipino dishes that are Chinese. And so then it was just really beautiful to see a young Chinese cook here in Mexico feel connected to Filipino food that they hadn't seen except for at their friends' houses in San Diego. And then, she could understand the flavor profile. So you just need that one sort of like connection or memory or a friend growing up from where you are to like relate to it, and then to do it in the setting of like meeting in Elena's kitchen was just really sweet. And that's then what the point of like cooking food or sharing yourself is. And so, and I think that's the answer too, is just like, yes, we have these opportunities to use technology in producing our food, but today I made a bunch of grandma food. This is not really how I cook normally. Me doing this book is not representative of the kind of like if I made brand new dishes that don't come from anywhere, they would look nothing like this. There's some dishes in there that are like that, but mostly these are grandma dishes, which took a lot of restraint as a professional chef to make a book like this. But for me, a really important thing to do with this restraint, because it's an introductory to show people the specificity of the food that I grew up with. Again, not saying that this is the book that represents all Filipino food, but the versions that I grew up with, which I think are quite good. But then there's something in there like a homemade Spam recipe that you can make in like little like aluminum tray tins and water baths in your oven. But I actually, not surprisingly, had access to some equipment like sealing like the plastic bag that had a tin of this kind of like, pink meat, and that actually like cooking that in a water bath in more of a scientific way proved to like look like a better Spam, like this like pink meat that's made in a can, thinking about American occupation in the Philippines. So that, because that's not a grandma dish, because that's like a factory made dish, using like machines to make this seal properly made it better, but that's literally coming from a machine rather than my grandmother. So I think that kind of like explains that bridge. But I like Spam. I love Spam.
I love Spam too. There must be something about Spam. So Nikki, what do you think?
Thank you for that prompt. What do I think?
About the kind of ancient technology versus the new technology, or kind of thinking about grandma food versus gastronomy food.
Yeah, so it's something that I think about a lot, because within the context of mezcal and the regulation of the category, they have started regulating according to categories like ancestral, traditional, or artisanal, not traditional, ancestral, artisanal, and then mezcal, which allows for certain industrial methods. And so I think a lot about this tension between certain kind of older, maybe we'll wait for the plane. So things like mashing by hand. Within the context of mezcal, you cook it in an earthen oven, and then it comes out, and there has to be some type of maceration prior to the fermentation. So mashing by hand is extremely labor intensive, and if you're doing continuous mashing over the course of your lifetime, it can be very damaging to your body. And so if there are certain newer technologies which allow for less wear and tear on the body, then I'm like, okay, well, that's more humane. However, also to think about, when we think about scale, you're like, okay, well, if it's easier to just like run everything through some type of machine and then it makes everything faster, that means that more mezcal can be produced, which also implies kind of massification. So I consider technology within the idea of economies of scale, and also kind of the humane quality of whether it's like good for you or not. And those are things that we always have to keep in balance. I don't think that there's necessarily like, oh, this is, because it is the old way, it is thus better. Because it also becomes this kind of fetishization of this way of life, which may not serve the people who are making it anymore. It's, I don't have a clear answer other than I think it's complicated, because especially working in the context of Oaxaca, I think that there is this often coming from the outside, it's like, oh, like look how amazing it is that people continue to make in these certain ways, but it's up to them, and the tradition is a living thing, and it's not something to be put behind kind of glass and preserved in that way. So
I love that. Tradition is a living thing. It's true. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I also love that you have to kind of, it's not in a kind of teleological kind of a straight line towards a progression, but rather perhaps it's a turn towards the past in order to progress. Like there is this kind of cycle of a spiral almost, absolutely, which can be very good to think about, not necessarily with the food culture, but also visual culture as well. I think a lot of artists are looking to the past and kind of thinking about the future as well. I think I want to slowly ask you guys to prepare questions. So that when I finish my next question, you can ask questions. So get ready in the next round so that we don't have any code moments, okay? So my next question is actually related to religion. I don't know why that came to me just when that kind of a military airplane passed by us, because I think we also talk about, Angela, actually literally the first event I attended for your book launch was a Catholic, or how you describe that event? What's the theme of that event?
It was a Roman Catholic themed dress-up party for my pre-release, which aesthetically,
it was in a chapel.
It was in a chapel, an 18th century chapel, and it was the first time I was distributing the book. But Catholicism is, I was baptized as an infant. I went to the most traditional California church as a kindergartner. As a 5-year-old, I think I was 4 and a half. I was raised in this preschool or kindergarten every morning, praying a part of the rosary. We were like 20, basically babies, we're like 4 or 5. And we all had little hooks with our name on it, and then we all had our designated rosary with our name on it. And there was a 50-foot Virgin Mary sculpture outside of this church. And so that's what I was, I was born Catholic. I went to church up until I was 17 every Sunday. And so for me, it's like this fun reclamation of, enjoying aspects of my own spiritual path, and knowing that my family they're very much Catholic, and you know, when I started identifying as queer, I just took a lot of steps away from that just to sort of find my own path and find out who I am. And one thing that I still love is the aesthetics, and so I had this like Roman Catholic themed party, and I dressed up like Santo Niño, which is this, I don't know if you all know who Santo Niño is, but in the Philippines, it's this miraculous little figurine, like brown skin figurine, that survived fire and is dressed up in this beautiful red cape and gold adornments, and my mom helped me make my costume, and so I had a really good time with it. I think like my experiences as an adult that's related to my Filipino background, which also has a lot to do with Catholicism, is like finding a way for me to sort of feel like myself and enjoy aspects of it. So having a party where like all my friends were dressed up as like nuns and priests and demons and angels, like was so healing for me.
I was a demon. Signed.
Yeah, I signed X to be the demon. But there's joy to be felt still with all of these things that may have felt oppressive in the past for me. But then again, it's like another connecting point to like other folks that I meet that were raised Catholic, or again like Mexican folks, and so so there's so many layers of connection. It's not just through our cuisine. It's then about religion, and then finding my own way of like celebrating that.
Yeah, I mean, I raised this connection because how much of Catholicism is related to the Spanish rule, and you know, of these colonies of a empire. So I wonder, I'm looking at you, Nikki, if you can explain to us some of those connections, perhaps. And I was also learned from Amelia, actually from the gallery, that there is a lot of connection to obviously kind of a Mediterranean Arab region in this city as well. I'm really kind of personally super curious about the diversity in food culture and also visual culture in the city. I want to ask Nikki and Elena, because you guys know this much better than I do, to kind of share a bit more about just kind of different kind of cultural influence that actually happening in the city currently, but also throughout the history as well, so that we can really think about different kinds of relationship that one can build with these conversations and perhaps future conversations as well.
Sure. So Mexico City was the seat of the administrative rule of the Viceroy of New Spain and the ecclesiastical seat. So during the period of the Manila Galleon, the spaces of a lot of acculturation were in the cofradías. So these were kind of religious organizations where folks from different places, I was going to say different strokes, but would gather together, and it was a kind of a network of mutual aid in a way through religion. So in this account that I was reading of our friend from Pampanga, when he passes away, he enlists one of his friends to bring 4 mules to Mexico City in honor of one of the saints or virgins. And I think that it's important to, like, taking a few steps back to remember that the Philippines and Manila, they were not under the jurisdiction of Spain directly, but under the jurisdiction of the viceroyalty of New Spain. So the administration happened out of Mexico City. And so I think that a lot of the imagery and the practices that arrived in Manila were inspired by the syncretic imagery that came out of the meeting between a Mesoamerican pre-Hispanic culture and the Spanish colonial rule. So it's interesting because I'm sure that some of the saints and some of the ways in which virgins and saints, et cetera, were depicted in the Philippines were actually coming from Mexico and not directly from Spain.
Elena, anything to add in terms of just kind of food culture-wise? What are the kind of influence you see here nowadays with new migration or old migration or different kind of a global practice or like different kind of global influence that happened in the city and perhaps currently, but also perhaps in the past as well?
Well, for me, what is very fascinating is that there are some techniques, like pre-Hispanic techniques of making food, like for example, tamales, like wrapping, that it's something very pre-Hispanic, but we also share that with the Filipinx. And it's always amazing to understand how this back and forward, where it started, like the limits. For me, the wrapping, it's always something associated to pre-Hispanic. However, I know there's also this kind of tamal, but it's made of rice. But it's with a banana leaf, and of course, we now in Mexico wrap with corn leaf, but also banana leaf and many other leaves. And we kind of forget all these connections. Like many of us will associate wrapping with banana leaves as pre-Hispanic, but of course it's not. But there are some times that you don't know where the boundaries are, and that's very beautiful. And what I really like about Angela's book is that it's not only about recipes. It's much more than that. It's about understanding a culture and a way of living that it's how you can really get into, because cooking is not just recipes, right? So in that sense, for example, I also find fascinating, as Nikki said, all this situation where Mexico was between the Spaniards and the Philippines, like really a bridge. And I think we never associate that. Like we always know that the Philippines are like or were a Hispanic colony, but it was not through Mexico. I mean, we don't get this association that was through Mexico, and that Mexico was really the bridge between the Philippines and the Hispanic. So I think what I can understand in terms of food is that more than the Spaniard influence, there's a Mexican influence in the Philippine food. And I think that's very, very fascinating. Even, for example, the champurrado, how you call it? Champurrado. But there is made out with rice instead of corn, but it's basically the same. And there are many similarities.
So it's the techniques are the same because the local ingredients, the crops are different, so they kind of replace certain things using the same technique. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I love these kind of thinking about globalism. You know, we often associate globalism or kind of a the de-global in the 90s, kind of thinking about financially or economic globalism, right? But it's more interesting to think about a new globalism that through old histories, perhaps creating new geographies and kind of thinking it's outside of, again, nationalistic kind of boundaries as well, thinking about these trade routes, thinking about migration patterns and thinking about all of these and what are these relationships that creates and what kind of history that can be written through food, through image, through art, and maybe it's time for your questions. Okay. So first one gonna be the brave person. We're gonna have a special, oh, here you go.
Hi, Angela. What's your favorite dish from your book and why?
My answer changes all the time, but I have two today. One is the most popular dish in the book, which is an adobo. And I think adobo is really interesting in the context of where we are today is because the name has a lot of confusion, I think, for when people hear about it, because they expect it might have a completely different flavor profile than it does. When you sort of deconstruct why that's maybe incorrect, not incorrect, but it's just not the right kind of adobo you're thinking about with Filipino food. It is because of Spanish colonization. Spanish folks came and had this, it's an indigenous dish, and called it that because of the way that it was seasoned. But when you think about a Filipino adobo, you're working with sour notes, and I think that's what makes this chicken dish really interesting. I think with Asian cuisine, when you think about sour flavors, you often think about Thai cuisine right away because they use lots of citrus. And in the Philippines, we use citrus and we use lots of vinegars, like coconut vinegars, etc. And so we use multi-layers of acid flavors for preservation methods, basically. So our indigenous dish, adobo, which is one of our most popular dishes, was preserved by way of vinegar. And the recipe is super simple. And so it's a dish that anyone I really think could make. Like my 11-year-old niece can make it. That's like the first dish that I could make from memory, like leaving home. And it just has a really unique flavor. It's just garlic, bay leaves, black peppercorn, soy sauce, and vinegar. And that's it. And that's all you need. And you can get that at a bodega in New York or here if you have some chicken. And so that's my favorite because it's the dish to make people that are like concerned about their own cooking skills, like that they can do it because it's one pot. And then also, weirdly, my favorite other dish is a corn slush, and it's super simple and it's vegan and it has very little ingredients. And I think as like a food nerd and longtime chef, I love tasting dishes that have very little ingredients because when you have them, it at least for me, provides a sense of wonder of like, how did this happen with these very few ingredients? And so what I love about it is the inspiration of the dish was something very American. Like when I grew up in San Jose, I'd go to the flea market with my mom, and I was a little kid just kind of just like staring at all the shiny things, not buying anything, but accompanying her. And after the flea market, I'd come home like dirty and sweaty, and she'd make me this treat. And it is just opening a can of creamed corn, dumping that in a bowl of crushed ice and topping it with sugar so it was like crunchy, and then pouring cold milk on top of that. And then I would eat that happily as a kid. And that's not a dish that you should try that dish, but like I'm not going to put that dish in the book. But from memory, thinking about how wonderful that experience was to have that refreshment, I made a version of it, which is just like fresh shucked corn. You cook it in a very small amount of water just to cover, just until the cornstarch has cooked through, so it's still a bit crunchy. The water is seasoned with a bit of salt and a little bit of honey, and then you puree it and then put it in a pan and put it in your freezer, similar to just how you make a granita. But as you stir it through the hours of freezing, because of the cornstarch, it has this really beautiful, like starchy, like sticky quality to it. And then that's the treat. And then I put that recipe in the book, and it's very easy to make. Also, I think an 11-year-old could make that dish. And then I did a version 2.0 that is not in the book, but makes it, to me, feel like a fine dining dish, like quote unquote fine dining. And it was simply making that dish for a small group of 15 people in Paris over the summer. And coincidentally, where I was cooking, we had a really beautiful, big, bright, sunny window, and I reserved all the corn hair, the corn silk, and dried it in the window, because I was thinking about one of my favorite dishes growing up is like Chinese chicken salad, which basically has fried noodles. So I dried the corn hair till it was really like, it was dry, there was no water, and then fried it in brown butter, because I had lots of butter available to me in France. And then what you have is like this nutty, corny, caramelized, tastes like maybe like cotton candy, but it's corn flavored and brown butter flavored, and you just drop it on top, and it's really impressive and really easy to make.
It was delicious.
Oh yeah, Nikki was there.
Nikki
had it. Yeah, so those are my two favorites right now, and I love that they're simple and they require very little ingredients, because then you can really think about the access and how cheap everything actually costs.
Thanks.
You look great. You look amazing.
Yeah, Nikki, this is a question for you. Thanks. You were talking a bit about the exchange of ingredients going from Mexico toward the Philippines, and also, of course, Asian people going from Manila to Acapulco. Do we know anything about similar human exchange happening in the other direction? Were indigenous people from Mexico taken back on the Manila galleons to Asia?
That is a really great question. However, I am not qualified to answer it. I can only imagine there was a bit of that, but I do think that, and we talked about this the other night, that I think that in general, people didn't really want to go back and brave the voyage. So often what was happening was large groups of people settling in the western part of Mexico. So we're talking about Guerrero, Jalisco, and Michoacan, which is why those are the areas where we have the oldest documented stills. But yeah, I'm sure there must have been. There were really interesting things like talavera, and different types of crafts that were using techniques from Asia and China and applying them in craft centers like Puebla. So yeah, we have talavera. Then there was all these lacquered biombos that were also being produced in Mexico by local craftspeople, and then making their way mostly to Europe. But I don't know much about the people, but the crafts and themselves.
Thank you. I kind of have the same question because I've been always fascinated by the story of the now de China, which is not it's not a now and it's not from China. It's El Galeón de Manila, which I think it's probably the most successful trade route, in economic terms, probably more successful than NAFTA, and lasted certainly longer. But if in Mexico, and it's a question for Angela, if in Mexico, if you go to this crafts museum like the Franz Mayer, or if you go to the museum in Acapulco, which is dedicated to the 250 years of trade with the Filipinx, you find these beautiful, amazing objects related to food, which were brought by the now de China, by the Galeón de Manila to Mexico. And they went to the homes of Mexicans and they were adopted by the Mexicans, certainly by upper class Mexicans. Some of them are full of silver and they're really beautifully arranged. But it's amazing, if you go to these museums, it's amazing the amount of artifacts that belong to these collections, and they came from the Philippines. So do you feel that in Philippines are these objects present, like Mexican objects that are present in museums or collections? Is there a presence of this? Because I always have that question. If the Galeón de Manila, we know that it came full of products to Mexico. Textiles and ceramics and crafts and spices. But I don't know if it went back empty or not.
So sorry, your question is, do I know of any that are also in the Philippines?
Yeah, if some artifacts like the ones we find in Mexico that came from the Philippines, if you find some Mexican artifacts in the Philippines.
Yeah, I would love to know the answer for that, and I think that's going to require. So part of what I was excited about to make this book is to spend some time in the Philippines, but because of the pandemic, that didn't happen. And at first, I was really angry about that because I wanted that to be a part of the journey. But now that I've started and completed this book all during the pandemic, instead of it being like a sort of linear start to finish of my journey of self or my journey of my relationship to the Philippines or even to Mexico, now it's requiring of me, and this is an absolute must, that I'm going to do a lot more work around this and go to the Philippines, and it's not going to be about the book but about that wonder, because I know that exists. It has to. Even when I just look at archaeological ceramics or sculptures, I feel something from them. And when I think about something way more practical that I did get to see, so for example, when I got to stay in Oaxaca to finish my book, there's tools that I grew up around in kitchens that are the same. So for example, my dad is from a town called Batangas, and Batangas is where most of the Filipino chocolate production comes from, which is why we have champorado, or why we have tablea, these little chocolate discs that are similar to Mexican a chocolate drink. It's very similar, pretty much the same. And we have the same tool that my dad would bring. My dad was the only one to use it in my home, and it's a batidor, I think, is that what we call it here? And I don't even know what we call it in Tagalog because I don't speak Tagalog, but the only other time I saw it outside of my house, outside of my dad using it, was coming here to Mexico. And so there has to be tons, including art, And yeah, and I'm on my quest to like learn what that is. So the curiosity is there. But we're starting with the batidora is all I know.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in quickly because it wasn't necessarily like, I mean, yes, I'm sure there's like a lot of artifacts and things, but we're talking about potatoes, you know, sweet potatoes, normal potatoes, tomatoes, chayote, chocolate, chile,
Mangoes.
yeah, corn, exactly. Manila. There's all sorts of products. So, I think that there's a lot of reasons why many of the stories of the people who are coming back and forth, or you know, coming from Mexico and then going to Manila are not told, with the exception of the peninsulares or the people who had administrative positions in Manila, because 1571 was the conquest of the Philippines, and so there are certainly Mexicans who settled in Manila as a part of that, and the people from Pampanga were auxiliaries in those wars. But yeah, mostly, I mean, we're talking about the movement of spices, of products, agricultural products.
Hi, I have a question for Angela and a comment for Elena. In general, Angela, where do you think the Filipino cuisine has the most influence from? Because you're an island, you're surrounded, you're close to Indonesia, Malaysia, Taiwan, China. You even have Australia kind of soon. Where do you think that in general, apart from Spain, obviously, have the most heritage on your food?
Yeah, I mean, when you get a chance to flip through it, it'll probably just pop out at you too. But doing the research on these dishes and over time looking at why dishes were made, for example, and how dishes were made, it's really interesting thinking about just a very hard timeline of like cultural history. So for example, there's a whole section that we call cold things and drinks because it's really hot in the Philippines and it was hot in California. And doing research about these icy drinks or access to freezers, basically, there was a period that we just didn't even have our own ice because we didn't have the technology of freezers. So we would ship in ice from the US. And so lots of these drinks were made from that time period of having access. Or, you know, I mentioned earlier that there's a ton of Chinese dishes that are Filipino. I mean, they're Filipino dishes, but they're Chinese. It's like pan-fried noodles or soups with like noodle soups or wonton noodle soups. So I think when I think about the cuisine as a whole, especially giving, like, say I cook a Filipino menu for someone, it might be really confusing as to like where all the flavors come from and why, because even thinking about it as an Asian cuisine, we use tons of butter and cheese, and that's pretty abnormal. Yeah, and that comes a lot. One of our main cheeses we use is called queso de bola, but that specific one my mom uses is actually from Portugal. Or we have like pan de sal, like all the names are Spanish, of course, but then the ingredients in which we use it, it's different than like a Chinese bao, like flavor-wise, because we use lots of butter. So I would say the main flavor profiles are like kind of tropical, warm weather ingredients, so thinking about the sours and like sour flavors and like mango and coconut, but then there's this layering of butters and cheeses, and then Chinese flavors. So it's kind of all over the place. And then if you look at the desserts, they're all like preserved jellies and preserved like beans, just so that we had access to these flavors in, again, like the warm tropical heat. We have like halo halo, which is like all preserved fruits and beans, which I think for someone that hasn't had it might think it tastes gross, but it's really good. And it's kind of our hodgepodge, and that's really what our cuisine is like, comes from so many different places, and then, of course, American influence as well.
Thank you. And I just want to say, I've been a cook for 30 years. I went to culinary school for some time, and I'm very keen with the food. And I want to say that my favorite restaurant by far in Mexico City is Rosetta. So
give it up for Rosetta.
More questions? Or is everyone hungry?
If they don't ask, they're not going to eat.
You heard that. So we need one more question, then we can all eat. So pressure is on. I was about to ask.
Angela, how much corn there is in the Philippines? Can you see corn around your food?
No, I mean, my corn recipe that's in there is literally from canned corn. So when I go to the Philippines, I don't think I have corn. Like, I've been to the Philippines once, and I also think that there aren't really any other corn dishes besides this canned corn recipe. So this is an interesting question because we're thinking about, we talked about tamales. And here in Mexico, of course, we've had them. They're wrapped in corn husk using masa. We use masa. And in the Philippines, we have a savory version as well. And it uses coconut milk, and it uses banana leaf and rice flour. So we have our own versions of that. And so I think the only additions of corn that we have in here is from the American time period. I think I have one soup that has pieces of corn in it that I added. That's not my traditional recipe of having growing. It's this beef soup, and I add corn to it because I had access to it in the summer and really liked it, but that's not traditional at all. So there isn't much corn in here. And I think that's why we then see those differences of something like tamales and Filipino, Pampangan tamales, specifically over what we can get here, or this sticky rice dessert that's wrapped in banana leaf, and that's this steamed sticky rice dessert. There's no presence of corn. But we have them, so we have them preserved. It's when we have corn, it's from a can, and we have corn used in a sweet setting, often with cheese, for example, but it comes from that time period of just receiving canned corn.
So as a way of closing, Angela, do you want to introduce the menu today? So that we know what we're eating?
Yeah. So we have a lot of rice because you eat, Filipino food is often heavily seasoned to sort of feed a lot of people, but all the food tastes the best with rice. So we're going to be eating some rice, some lumpia, which we mentioned today, which is a really thin egg roll. We have sinigang.
Was shrimp paste in them?
No, that's made with pork and beef and vegetables. Okay. And then we're having sinigang, which is also another indigenous dish of the Philippines, which is a sour tamarind broth soup with a bunch of vegetables and pork. And then chicken adobo, which is the dish I mentioned earlier. So that's all available in the back. We also have some cocktails.
Oh, yeah. You have to introduce that cocktail.
Yeah. So
it's called reverse.
Yeah,
go ahead.
It's not Filipino, but it tastes Filipino to me. And that also came from, I mentioned there's several dishes in there that I've just made up, but it feels like it makes sense with the cuisine. And so that dish, or that drink, is called the reverse aging cocktail because it was a response to a dystopian film, sci-fi film that an artist, Miriam Benani, made. And the concept is that Miriam created this prison island that is fictional between Morocco and New York. And if you, in her sci-fi future, if we didn't have, at this time, airplanes weren't around, and so you used teleportation devices to travel. But fake, American soldiers would capture people and bring them on this prison island, and this is the prison island drink I made up for.
But it's a reverse aging also.
It's called reverse aging because the characters had access to reverse aging products. So that's what you're going to have today.
It's delicious, I can tell you that. Delicious. And this time is a special because we're made with mezcal, and typically it's made with vodka. So yes. You have a special edition of that reverse aging drink today. And I also want to mention that we have the books to sell in the bookstore here, and I believe Angela has signed most of them.
Yeah, I think they're all signed.
Yeah, so enjoy the lunch, and the conversation will continue. And Amelia, Go ahead.
Gracias, Angela, Elena, Nikki. Muchas gracias a todos. Como dijo, the book is on sale at the bookstore, and there's a recuperation fee for the food. If also you can cover it in the bookstore, you will get a receipt to get into the back part of the gallery. Thank you all.